Hi, I'm Peter J. Ray. Welcome. Today's topic is James Madison Part 4. We stopped last time in 1812, and the War of 1812 had started, and there was a lot of things. There had been a lot of bad things happening, a lot of defeats, but there were victories, and then there was some dramatic action in the Atlantic Ocean between the U.S. Navy and the British Navy, between the Azores Islands and the Canary Islands. That would be over toward Portugal on the eastern part of the Atlantic Ocean. And the U.S. Ship was the USS United States, captained by Stephen Decatur, fighting against the British HMS Macedonian. And the Americans, we won this battle, so it was great. Finally, we needed some good news. And after the battle, the British flag was captured and brought back to the U.S. And this Congressman Sam Mitchell, on seeing hearing the news of the victory and seeing this British flag, he said this, quote, "I believe I was in the very condition of Themistocles after viewing the trophies won by the Athenians from the Persians at the Battle of Marathon." I love these references to ancient history, that the people back then really were much more knowledgeable about about history in general and than we are today. The following year in May, the U.S. Army invaded Canada and captured York, the city of York, which was later renamed Toronto in Ontario. Sadly, after that victory, General Zebulon Pike was killed in an explosion. This was an accident. A powder magazine blew up. That was very tragic. General Pike was an explorer in the Southwest, and Pike's Peak was named after him. Now, one mistake the U.S. Army made is they set fire to the Parliament buildings in York, which was the capital of Upper Canada, and later the British retaliated for that. In June of 1813, there was fighting again in the Atlantic Ocean. The USS Chesapeake fought against the HMS Shannon. And in this fighting, the U.S. captain James Lawrence was mortally wounded. And his dying words were, "Don't give up the ship. Fight her till she sinks." So the British won that battle, and those words of Captain Lawrence were immortal. Don't give up the ship. And one of his good friends in the Navy, Commodore Matthew Perry, learned about this. He had his own personal battle flag created that had the words "Don't give up the ship" printed on the flag. So this battle was in the Atlantic Ocean near Boston. So anyway, in December of 1813, the British invaded New York State, and they burned Buffalo, captured Fort Niagara on the Niagara River, and there was havoc wreaked. And there were the British and their Indian allies. There was a massacre of Americans, and Americans were scalped also in Lewiston and Niagara in New York. And there was a lot of fear among Americans living near the border of Canada. So a lot of them started moving into the interior of New York State as a result. Now, one of the main things in the war was control of the Great Lakes, because water back then was the fastest way to move around, and the British had control of the Great Lakes, and that made it easier for them to fight in the West. And so it was decided the U.S. had to challenge the British, and Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry was this leader in the U.S. Navy, and he organized a fleet in Erie, Pennsylvania, to challenge British control of Lake Erie. And one of the great moments in the war was fought in September of 1813, and 9 American ships fought British ships near South Bass Island and Put-in Bay in western Lake Erie. And in the fighting, Commodore Perry had named his flagship the Lawrence. and he had to abandon that ship because it was struck by cannon fire and was sinking. But as he was leaving the ship, he grabbed his personal battle flag. "Don't give up the ship." The dying words of his friend Commodore Lawrence. And so this was, and the U.S. won this battle. Commodore Perry won the battle, and the British were defeated, and the United States gained control of Lake Erie and the Great Lakes. So this was a great victory. And Commodore Perry sent a message to General William Henry Harrison, quote, "We have met the enemy, and they are ours." If you go to South Bass Island and Put-in-Bay, there's a huge monument for Commodore Perry. And in Cleveland, there's a statue downtown Cleveland for him as well. So he was a great hero of the War of 1812. Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry. And he fought for his friend, James Lawrence, and used his words, "Don't give up the ship," as inspiration on his battle flag. So that was a big deal. So there were victories which were needed. The following month was another American victory. The U.S. Army, led by General William Henry Harrison, fought and defeated the British and their Indian allies on the Thames River in Ontario, Canada, not too far from Detroit. And in this battle, Tecumseh was killed. Yeah, so this was big news because Tecumseh had really, inspired American Indians to fight Americans. And so the battle cry of this battle is "Remember the Raisin." So the death of Tecumseh. It's nice today. They have a Tecumseh Festival in Chillicothe, Ohio. Today a lot of people admire American Indians, and which is good. We should have respect for the noble opponent, respect for everyone, and certainly Tecumseh was a great man. But his death was a good thing at the time, because this really was the end of his this Indian Confederacy that he'd been organizing, because he was the leader, this very, very charismatic leader that had inspired American Indians. Now he was gone, so it was so definitely a tragedy for American Indians. But we had opposite interests at that time. So anyway. James Madison said this late in 1813, quote, "The war with its vicissitudes is illustrating the capacity and the destiny of the United States to be a great, a flourishing, and a powerful nation." In March of 1814, the Creek Indians had been inspired by Tecumseh, and they were attacking American settlers in Alabama. And the U.S. Army, led by Andrew Jackson, traveled to Alabama to fight the Creek Indians, and there was a major battle of Horseshoe Bend, and the Creek Indians were defeated. They had massacred American settlers. So this is the beginning of the rise of Andrew Jackson's fame, and Americans at the time were very grateful to him, because there was a war. There was a war of conquest, and Jackson was a great Indian fighter. Nowadays, there's a tendency to disparage him, to blame him for this and other reasons. But at the time, Americans were grateful because he created safety. He made it safe for the settlers to move into these lands. And I don't think, if you want to blame Jackson, you have to blame all the people at the time. But I'm not willing to do that. I don't think we should condemn our ancestors for doing what they believed they needed to do, because this is part of our country, the development of our country. Europeans coming here and people wanting their own land. Little geography. We've talked about, the Niagara, over in Fort Niagara, Niagara Falls. The Niagara River is not a river, but a massive channel through which water draining all the Great Lakes and tributaries pours out of Lake Erie and plunges over the massive falls, Niagara Falls, and into Lake Ontario. That's a pretty interesting geography. In July of 1814, the Battle of Chippewa took place in Ontario near Niagara Falls, a big American victory, near Buffalo, and the British were shocked in this battle. There was the famous quote, "Those are regulars, by God," famous phrase. 148 British soldiers died and 60 Americans died. Now, one of the biggest problems we had in the war is the Secretary of War, John Armstrong, was no good. He was lazy, and he freely admitted lacking diligence and loving ease. So this is not good. And the thing is, James Madison was a nice guy. He should have fired this John Armstrong because the guy was no good. And in July, there was a fear that the British would attack Washington City, the national capital. And Dolly reported, quote, a state of perturbation. The thing is, John Armstrong didn't do anything to protect Washington. There was all the news that the British were coming. He said, oh, no, they're just going to attack Baltimore. In August, President Madison was with the U.S. Army at Bladensburg, Maryland, before the British attack. And historian Walter R. Borneman wrote this, quote, save for Abraham Lincoln poking his head above the ramparts at the fortifications surrounding Washington during the Civil War, it was the only time an American president was ever on a battlefield as commander-in-chief. So the British were coming, August 1814, and so this was, as time passed, it became more and more obvious that the British were coming to attack Washington City. So it was decided the State Department papers, including the Declaration of Independence, were taken and hid in a grist mill in a farmhouse near Leesburg, Virginia. James Madison wrote a letter to his wife Dolly. He was out of Washington and she was back in the White House. And he wrote this, quote, the enemy seems stronger than had been reported. It might happen that they would reach the city with the intention to destroy it. She should be ready at a moment's notice, a warning to leave. On August 23, a midnight message from James Monroe to President Madison at the White House said this, quote, the enemy are in full march on Washington. Have the materials prepared to destroy the bridges. You had better remove the records. So the British came, they just marched on into Washington, actually without any resistance, virtually no resistance. And on August 24th, they were in the city, and they proceeded to set buildings on fire. And they set fire to the White House and the Capitol. And this was terrible. This was a disaster. You know, the last thing you want in war is for your capital city to be destroyed. And this is what happened. And without any fighting, this John Armstrong was really to blame. Very demoralizing, especially set the White House on fire, and Dolly was able to save the portrait of George Washington. Fortunately, there was a storm, and the British set the White House on fire, but it did not completely burn. The interior was gutted. Everything, all this stuff was destroyed. But the building still stood because this storm came and put out the fire. President Madison never lived in the White House again because it took time to rebuild it, and by the time it was ready for occupancy, he was no longer president. Yeah, and the British, said that this was retaliation for the American burning of York or Toronto, Canada. And after they used to call it the President's House or the Executive Mansion. After it was repainted, it was renamed the White House because of this fresh white paint. So everyone had to get out of, the Congress. Everyone had to leave. It was kind of like the American Revolution when the British took Philadelphia, which was the capital. And Dolly actually there had been a meal prepared that wasn't eaten by the folks in the White House, and the British soldiers ate that meal that had been cooked because it was still there. They had to leave all in a big hurry. So after, this was a dark moment in American history, and after the White House was burned, Madison and Dolly moved into a private home, the Octagon House, just west of the White House. And later in 1815, they moved into a house on Pennsylvania Avenue on 19th Street. It took up until 1817 before the White House was ready for occupancy, and that was during the presidency of James Monroe. So it was obvious that this John Armstrong had to go, and he was really to blame for the destruction of Washington City, and he resigned. And James Monroe, who was the Secretary of State, took the added responsibility of Secretary of War, and he played a major role in rallying American forces at this low point in American history, because he had a tremendous amount of energy. After destroying Washington, the British attacked Baltimore, and fortunately, there was a victory achieved. They bombarded Fort McHenry on September 13th, all night and all day, pounding the fort with cannons and rockets. A Baltimore lawyer named Francis Scott Key wrote a poem, which was later set to music, and is now it's the Star Spangled Banner, our national anthem, and it comes from the battle in 1814, the British attack on Fort McHenry and Baltimore, Maryland. And the poem, very wonderful poem. He just described what he saw. It was during the night as the cannon fire was lighting the sky with the explosions lit the sky, and he saw the American flag still waving. And the British did not take Fort McHenry. So he wrote this quote: "Oh, say can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming." He's talking about when the sunrise, you could still see the flag, "whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming. And the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave." That was it's such an inspiring words. President Madison was depressed in October of 1814, naturally because of the destruction of Washington City. William Wirt wrote about Madison, quote, he quote, "looks miserably shattered and woebegone. In short, he looked heartbroken." So this was a low point in American history. Yeah, well, the Battle of Baltimore, the victory at Baltimore had raised spirits. There was still all this talk of New England seceding. In November, Vice President Elbridge Gerry died. In December, the Treaty of Ghent, ending the War of 1812, was signed in Europe, but it took time before that news reached the United States. So the peace treaty was signed. There had been ongoing negotiations in Europe. In January of 1815, the British decided to attack New Orleans. They didn't know the peace treaty had been signed, and so they decided to attack New Orleans, and this was a big deal. Remember, the Mississippi River was such an important thing for our country, and even though the Louisiana Purchase had given us control of the Mississippi, this was still the colonial era, and the British decided they were going to take it. So this was a big deal, and we got news that the British were going to do this. So Andrew Jackson, and James Monroe rallied Americans, and a lot of folks, a lot of militia, citizen soldiers started traveling south to New Orleans to fight the British. And so in January, so the British came, the Americans were ready. A lot of the Americans were, they were sharpshooters from hunting. And this was a tremendous victory, actually the greatest victory since Yorktown. One of the great victories in American history, the U.S. victory at New Orleans in January 1815, led by Andrew Jackson. 6,000 British troops attacked. 2,600 British troops were killed, wounded, and captured. And only 7 Americans were killed and 6 wounded. So this was a tremendous victory. And, we showed the British, that we could fight. And the news that the February 4th is when the news came to Washington City of this victory at New Orleans. And 10 days later, the news came of the Treaty of Ghent, ending the War of 1812. The victory at New Orleans really led to, made Andrew Jackson extremely famous. Americans were so grateful because if the British had taken New Orleans, then we were in big trouble, because then the Mississippi River system would be blocked and we couldn't use it for transportation. It was so vital. So this was really something, and so the mood in our country was sky high. The victory at New Orleans, the treaty had been signed. Now historians, it's popular to be cynical. People say, "Oh, it was a worthless battle," stuff like. No, I don't agree with that, because we earned respect from the British, and see, the treaty had been signed but had not been ratified. And if the British had won at New Orleans, they could have taken it and kept it. So this was a tremendous thing that happened, and really made Andrew Jackson extremely popular and famous, and led him to becoming president himself later. Former President John Adams, in retirement, wrote this in 1815, quote, "Mr. Madison's administration has proved great points long disputed in Europe and America. 1. He has proved that an administration under our present Constitution can declare war. 2. That it can make peace. 3. That money or no money, government or no government, Great Britain can never conquer this country or any considerable part of it. 4. That our officers and men by land are equal to any of Wellington's forces from Spain or Portugal. 5. That our navy is equal to any that has ever floated on the ocean." Remember when we started talking about the war, the British had 600 ships and the U.S. 16, but we had several major victories by the U.S. Navy in the War of 1812. After the war, Americans were very patriotic, and this was the end of talk of secession by New England. And the Federalist Party was really weakened and discredited because they did not support the war, and they were also involved in this talk of secession. So the Federalist Party, this was the beginning of the end of the Federalist Party. John Adams wrote again, quote, "A more necessary war was never undertaken. It is necessary against England, necessary to convince France that we are something, and above all necessary to convince ourselves that we are not nothing." Albert Gallatin, who had been in the cabinet of Madison, wrote this, quote, "In every respect, I must acknowledge that the war has been useful. The character of America stands now as high as ever on the European continent, and higher than it ever did in Great Britain." One of the things Americans felt proud of was the victory at New Orleans, because so many, when the news came, so many guys traveled to New Orleans from different parts of the Midwest, Tennessee, Kentucky, Ohio, and Alabama, and so forth. And so it was really a national achievement. Albert Gallatin, who was the Secretary of the Treasury, again wrote this, quote, "The war renewed and reinstated the national feeling of character which the Revolution had given, and which was daily lessening. The people are more American. They feel and act more like a nation." The Republican citizens of Baltimore this organization, people called themselves this, had this to say about the War of 1812, quote, "That struggle has revived with added luster the renown which brightened the morning of our independence. It has called forth and organized the dormant resources of empire. It has tried and vindicated our republican institutions. It has given us that moral strength which consists in the well-earned respect of the world, and in a just respect for ourselves. It has raised up and consolidated a national character, dear to the hearts of the people, as an object of honest pride and a pledge of future union, tranquility, and greatness." Historian Walter R. Borman wrote this, quote, "After the War of 1812, there was no longer any doubt that the United States of America would become a force to be reckoned with in North America and in time throughout the world. The war had forged a nation." Now, one of the problems during the war is that the money supply tripled during the War of 1812. Americans lost 66% of their money through inflation because we had a corrupt banking system. In 1816, the Second Bank of the United States was chartered, and this was more financial monkey business, inflation. It protected dishonest banks, organized fraud, and perpetuated losses. In October of 1816, President James Madison was extremely popular. The following month, in November, there was a presidential election, and James Monroe was elected as the 5th President of the United States. He easily defeated the Federalist candidate Rufus King, and this was a tribute to James Madison, a continuation of his policies. And James Monroe had played a major role in the end of the war, during the dark days after the destruction of Washington City. And so Americans realized that and he was a huge help to President Madison and our country during those dark days. In December of 1816, Indiana became the 19th state. So in March of 1817, James Monroe was inaugurated as the 5th President of the United States, and James Blake, the mayor of Washington City, spoke a tribute to outgoing President James Madison. Quote, "Power and national glory, sir, have often before been acquired by the sword, but rarely without the sacrifice of civil or political liberty. When we reflect that this sword was drawn under your guidance, we cannot resist offering you our own as well. A nation's thanks for the vigilance with which you have restrained it within its proper limits, the energy with which you have directed it to its proper objects, and the safety with which you have wielded an armed force without infringing a political, civil, or religious right." We had a lot of problems during the war, and the thing is, President Madison did not violate civil rights. Sometimes this happens during war. The government says, well, we got to be tough. We can't allow criticism. We have to take away some of the people's rights to fight the war, and he didn't do that. He really didn't do that because he believed in the Constitution, and so during later wars, actually, you had presidents like Abraham Lincoln, Franklin D. Roosevelt, who did take some of the people's rights away. But anyway, so you have to give him credit for believing in the rule of law, although it's debatable whether he should have done more to make it easier to fight the war. But anyway, the main thing is you don't want to lose your freedom in fighting a war. So James Madison was freed from his responsibilities. His presidency came to an end, and they were going home to Montpelier, James and Dolly. On the trip home, they were on a steamboat on the Potomac River. One of the passengers said this about Madison, quote, "He talked and jested with everybody on board and reminded me of a schoolboy on a long vacation." So he was back home at Montpelier, very happy to be home and happy to be finished with the responsibilities of the presidency. So it was a return to farming, and he could read books and enjoy the peace of Montpelier. And he was living on his savings from the presidency, but he had financial problems for the rest of his life because he really wasn't able to do well as a farmer. And it's kind of similar to Thomas Jefferson and so forth. In 1818, James Madison wrote this, quote, "The belief in a God all-powerful, wise, and good is so essential to the moral order of the world and to the happiness of man that arguments which enforce it cannot be drawn from too many sources." Yeah, he was having financial problems during these years, but regardless, he was still very hospitable, and he had a lot of people coming for dinner. So he was maintaining this Virginia tradition of a Virginia gentleman. Sometimes, as I say, he would have 20 for dinner, and this was an expense. James K. Balding, a visitor at Montpelier, wrote this about James Madison. "He spoke without reserve, sometimes on literary and philosophical subjects, and not infrequently, for he was a capital storyteller. He would relate anecdotes highly amusing and interesting. He was a man of wit, relished wit in others, and his small, bright blue eyes would twinkle most wickedly when lighted up by some whimsical conception." We're out of time. Next time we'll finish the life of James Madison. Thank you very much for watching. I really appreciate it. God bless you, and we'll see you next time.